Welcome, everybody. I'm Michael Brooks, joined by...
Kyle Kulinski.
And this is our second joint strategy session, which you can watch on the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel and, of course, on the monster, awesome Secular Talk channel. You should be subscribed to both. This was going to be a live stream, but we're having this, like... Actually, I'm basically having a sort of semi-panic attack because I'm supposed to do my main show in about 45 minutes. TMBS is supposed to go live. Hopefully it'll be resolved by then. But we still needed to record this because this has been it's been way too long since we last talked. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing good, man. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Good, besides the YouTube anxiety. But we wanted to touch on a couple of things. You know, Kyle and I think mostly look at things in very similar ways, and where we don't, it's actually interesting in a way that I think, you know, conversations can make us all better and more effective in terms of winning left campaigns and movements and so on. But we wanted to talk tonight about a couple of different things. Probably have time for two serious things and maybe some fun with Dave, and maybe Dave is the reason why YouTube is down. He's just like...
Well, I'm all about these conversations, Michael. I'm all about these ideas.
It's reached a tipping point, which is very funny. All of a sudden, everybody, I feel like I can do it. Like, dude, I was making fun of Dave Rubin before it was popular.
You were. No, you were ahead of everybody when it came to even Sam Harris and definitely Dave Rubin. My favorite thing about Dave Rubin is that sometimes he doesn't even bother to fill in the blanks. He just goes right to, like, let's have conversations and let's talk about ideas. But then when you ask him, like, okay, what specific ideas are you talking about? He's like, you know, the ideas and stuff, bro.
I love how the most amazing move, right? All right, yeah, let's just get this out of the way. But this is a new observation that hit me that was pretty funny about him, which is like he does those moves, like, because I'm writing this book on all of these guys and this whole. And how to deal with like the new right and the IDW and all this stuff. And so I'm rewatching the classic, Rogan UPS exchange, which it's so funny that I'm literally transcribing just part of it in the book. But what I love about Rubin is like when he gets cornered, even by like a guy who he's not like, Rogan's not there to grill him by any stretch of the imagination. But it's just like, oh, I'm making a complete ass of myself. And then he's just like, yeah, I mean, I'm just more interested in it, like, intellectually. And you know what really struck me as fucking hilarious is that, like some people who are like, very smart people, like not Dave Rubin people, like, people who are, pretty thoughtful people, pretty informed, can put stuff together. And then sometimes they might like encounter an idea that's like on a super abstract level. And you'll say like, I don't know, like that's kind of above my pay grade or something. What I love is like Dave's technique of just like, all of the basic stuff, I totally don't have covered. I'm only interested. like it's just incredible when you're out is like, no, I don't do fractions because I'm interested in physics.
No, it's even better than you're saying. It's like there were multiple times where Joe Rogan just like casually caught him stone cold dead, like just dead wrong about something. And Rubin's response is like, well, at an intellectual level, I care about that. Like, I really care about it at an intellectual level. It's the idea. Like, I like the idea of total deregulation and letting these builders do whatever they want, Joe. I'm not saying it'll actually work in real life, but I like the idea of that argument.
Right. Just like I like the idea of insert Castro joke right now. So let me just say, all right, so that's all right. Well, everybody's got to, it's a rite of passage in any friendship built in the modern world. Just a little bit of making fun of Dave, but we wanted to talk also about, I mean, the first one is you want to hit on this idea of like, and we don't have it that spelled out, but that there might be a little bit of a difference between a politics that's rooted in kind of like, I would say socialism and international solidarity versus like a kind of left isolationism. I think, these are one of those conversations. First of all, does that setup make sense to you? And also I think like, practically speaking, this is one of those things where probably on a fair amount of policies, it's going to look very, pretty much the same in practice. But I think there are some really important differences in terms of like how you're approaching problems. And I have one example in mind, but I'll get to that in a second. What is your kind of sense of that? Do you buy that there's a distinction?
So first of all, I kind of agree with what you just said there, that functionally, it's kind of the same thing. But my interest in this conversation is actually more just hearing your take on what the exact distinction is, because in my mind, I never really liked the term isolationism, because I always felt like it had a negative connotation to it. And I always preferred non-interventionist, because I feel like isolation sounds like it has other things that come along with it, maybe like involving trade, like being a trade isolationist, or it just always struck me as having more of a negative connotation, where non-interventionist sounds more benign. It sounds like value neutral when you say non-interventionist. But yeah, I always fancied myself just, when asked what my foreign policy beliefs are, I definitely say non-interventionist, and you could throw in there anti-imperialist. I'm fine with politicians using the argument of like, these interventions don't work, but, I prefer more of an argument of they're immoral and they're illegal when it comes to international law. But so what would you describe your position as? You said more socialist internationalist, and obviously that entails anti-imperialism and non-interventionism. But how does it go beyond that? Like, what's the distinction?
So I think the distinction is like, I'm going to sound like Big Lebowski. One part of it is an ethos, man. And then the other part of it is, I think, there's a couple areas that are a little bit potentially a big policy difference. And I'm just going to like not speak around it. I totally don't want this to be, okay, I won't even mention the specific person's name, because it's really not about a specific candidate. But as an example, when you go to Syria, so I'll work backwards in the sort of the more like consequential effect. To me, one, like, and this is where I think, like, yeah, there's basically on many policy levels, there's very little practical difference. But, even while I 100% believe that, certainly Assad and his patrons are butchers and have killed a massive amount of people, and I don't believe that the uprising against him was like some conspiracy or false flag. I think it reflected genuine anger at the economics and politics of the Assad government, which in fact were, not nationalist, not left-wing at all. And then at the same time, I 100% oppose U.S., CIA, Saudi, and Gulf intervention as well, 100%, completely. And I'm just trying to have like an honest, assessment of all the variables in the situation. But on the other hand, I would say like, okay, so we both oppose military action, but what is our opinion on refugees? How do we vote in terms of protecting refugees? How do we push the administration, particularly obviously under Trump, but even under Obama, to do a lot more to confront and deal with and frankly pay for our role in generating the refugee crisis in that region. And so to me, I think isolationism, I agree with you, it does have a bad connotation. I would also say it does have a bad connotation with those issues around refugees, around immigration, around movement of people. And I'm not to say that like, some of these issues are complicated. I think, do I believe in open borders? Yeah, as like a decades-long potential project in the future. But in the short term, I do think demilitarizing the border is a very goddamn important thing, right? You could still have a border that is not militarized. So to me, when I hear, and then one other example I'll just throw in, like some people have well, I don't want to say overlearned, but like, should the United States be coup-mongering and interfering abroad? Of course not, period. But some have said even to the point of like, well, I feel uncomfortable. And I've seen a couple, nobody major saying this. This is just on the top of my head right now. Of like, I'm not sure Ro Khanna should be sending a letter demanding that the Trump administration encourage an investigation of the corrupt conviction of Lula, because the United States should never comment on the internal affairs of another country, period. My opinion is that people should be able to comment and work on whatever the hell they want to across any borders, because I do think workers across borders and people who share values across borders can share politics and interests. And I think that's the ethos part.
So this is a little bit of a pivot, but when do you think it's justified to use military force?
When do I think it's justified to use? I mean, I have a pretty conservative definition of that mostly, which is that, in a situation of like extreme and objective preventative threat, right? And preventative, not preemptive. Now, I also think, and this is also where, again, I don't necessarily adhere to like a rigid rule set, and it might be another, area of disagreement. Like I've said as an example, I've been very critical of like many aspects of Russian foreign policy too, not like all the hacking stuff, but like just its own areas of influence, right? Just like the United States. And that I've also said a million times that like if Russia sends troops and presence to Venezuela, which undermines our effort to have a coup there, that's great. Because in the practical and the real world, that undermines a greater harm. So similarly, while I oppose U.S. presence in Syria, I think keeping like a couple of hundred people there, supporting this pretty successful Kurdish experiment in government, I support on balance, right? Because on the other hand, I don't necessarily have like a hard and fast rule about all of these things in each cases. Like I don't necessarily think from like a first premise and then fit everything into that. I think you also have to deal with the world as it is. But I think in general, military action and certainly war needs to be the last resort, pretty much, unless it's, an immediate, absolute, clearly cut threat.
That's interesting, because I think we do have a slight difference then, because I am more inclined to go based off of like a principle and then act based off of that.
Right.
And I will freely admit that in some instances it gets messy as a result of that. So
mine does too.
I think
right.
Well, yeah, there's no avoiding it. The world is a messy place.
Exactly.
But like I would use military force similar to you only in cases of like genuine defense of the country. But then, the most logical response to this, which I've heard a zillion times, is like, okay, well, what about if there's a genocide happening somewhere? And, my response to that is always, as long as we're not going at it unilaterally, as long as it's an international effort to try to prevent some sort of obvious, like, wrongdoing or genocide, something of that nature, then I'm fine with it. But we have to be a nation among nations and not a nation above nations, because, like, oftentimes, and this is what people struggle digesting, it's like we are oftentimes on the bad side of that equation.
100%. I have no trouble digesting that. It's one of the reasons I respect your work so much, is that you are very clear on that. Yeah.
I'm talking about, like the people who still have, maybe 25% Harris-ism in their brain still. And, we have good intentions, and intentions are very important, and that's the main difference.
We have
good
intentions.
Well, if you're propping up, a dictator in Saudi Arabia who's committing a genocide in Yemen, and you're sitting idly by as they kill women because they were protesting for the right to drive, and beheading people in the public square. It's like, well, I don't give a shit about your intentions. I care about what are you actually doing in the world. I don't care what you think is in your head. So, that's my reaction to that in terms of when we use force. But to go back to like a point you made before about refugees, that's interesting, because I always thought of I just kind of thought of it as just a totally separate issue. Not saying I wouldn't agree with you on the issue itself on its own merits, because I think I would. But I never really linked that to my view on foreign policy. I just kind of thought of it as like a separate issue, in the same way that I would think of like the minimum wage is one issue, and then, legalizing marijuana is another issue. You're saying that these things, basically, socialist internationalism is like, you have to look at these things as an amalgamation, and it's all like all part of one project.
Well, I mean, even if you're looking at it, I mean, yeah, if you have my set, definitely. But I would say even if you were to look at it from, just like a quote unquote realist standpoint, right? Which neither you or I really have in our politics. But like the literature in international relations or people dealing with this stuff now, and mostly making a ton of mistakes. Yeah, I definitely think you can't talk about like international relations is diplomacy. It's military action, but it's also diplomacy. It's also the environment. It's also the migrations of people. And of course, those things also intersect a lot with domestic policy, like you point out all the time in terms of misspent spending priorities. But even things like, there's many different elements of dealing with, refugee and migration issues. And I think obviously our primary responsibility is to fight the brutality and the racism of like the Trump administration as an example, 100%. And then at the same time, and I don't think that like there shouldn't be anything controversial about this, which is like actually, while there should be open, very liberalized borders and the opportunity for people to go where they want to go, that makes for a better society. And those are, our values. Plenty of people, as an example, are so desperate to have, to even under Trump leave El Salvador to try to get a refugee status. Well, that relates to the types of foreign policies the United States has implemented in that region. So I do think it's sort of like all part of the same package. And I do think the isolationist view, look, the advantage is let's stop engaging in all of these, wars. Let's pull back 100%. But I feel like on the other hand, it's like, well, first of all, what is that actually going to look like in practice? Because the truth is, as soon as you become president, you're heading up an empire, whether you like it or not. And does that also mean that you pull out on all these other things that are both our responsibility precisely because of the things you talked about and are just also part of problems in the international system? And the only other thing I want to say really quick, and I think that this is an area that like I have a guy, Daniel Bessner, on my show a lot, who I think you'd really like and you should read. And, he's somebody whose whole career is dedicated to opposing so-called humanitarian interventions and explaining the military-industrial complex and also the intellectual roots of it. But he's also saying like a mistake that the left has also made is that we've only been dissenters and critics. We haven't said like, what if somebody who actually does have a decent foreign policy become president? What does that actually look like? Because they are going to get asked these questions like, trade with China or not having a new Cold War with China, but also at the very least registering that we're not happy about like the abuse of the Uyghurs as an example. And that is the part where it's like, I think a lot of it is, going into the future and we have no idea what the answers are. And just that law can't always give us the framework because, law is subservient to power anyways, right? Like these international legal frameworks are subverted mostly by us and everybody else all the time. They come down to raw power issues. So we have to figure out how do we rework how we actually use power.
So if I could try to sum up like based off everything we've said so far, if I could try to sum up how we would define the difference between what you call left isolationism versus socialist internationalism. Left isolationism is from the framework of, hey, we should pull out of all these wars because it would help us here at home. Whereas socialist internationalism is more about, hey, we should stop doing all that and we should do a couple other things along with it. And the reason we should do it is not just because it helps us, but it also helps the victims of U.S. empire.
I think that's pretty good. Yeah. And and also that it's all connected, right? Like, because I also am a big believer too that even the more like altruistic good of us to do is also pretty much fundamentally in our self-interest as well. And, like go back to blowback. You know what I'm saying?
So now let me ask you this, because you know me, I'm if there's one thing that I think I do more than anything else, it's the strategy aspect of all this stuff.
Right.
And I'll tell you that I don't disagree with you on the substance of it, but I genuinely believe that like a left non-interventionism can be sold significantly better than socialist internationalism to your average American. Would you agree with that or no?
To me, no, because I do think that so much of this stuff, other than, by the way, a handful of very specific issues, most of which are mostly domestic besides trade, which we haven't even talked about, but trade is another huge one that I think exists in this that obviously has major implications for American workers, but also people on the outside. I think if it's framed right, you can sell this to people as part of like, our like responsibility as a country, even like tapping into some of that like pride that people feel, frankly, in being parts of the United States and like what we supposedly represent. So but I think like, look, on a really simple top line, and this is where, again, practically there isn't much difference. My emphasis would be, and over 90%, to go to people and be like, look, I don't want to take your kid and send them overseas to have their legs blown off. I want them to have an awesome job. So, that's probably what you'd say too.
But then again, I think we're effectively agreeing.
Yeah, probably.
Because my whole point is like, if you go to people and you say, hey, listen, these wars are stupid, these wars are dumb, and you don't even necessarily have to say the other part, which is true, which is they're illegal and immoral. But if you just say these wars are stupid, these wars are dumb, and we should really take all this money that we're wasting overseas and we should do a giant infrastructure project here in this country and give everybody a job and, with good wages and all that stuff. I think that sells better than, saying, hey, we should have solidarity with our comrades who have been destroyed under the boot of U.S. empire in South America.
I wouldn't say the word comrades.
I was kind of.
No, I got you. I mean, let me just say look, I think you're right in terms of what would be easiest to sell. I do think that you can sell and talk about broader and more altruistic things to people. And I do think that at some point that does have to be part of your pitch in general. But the second thing I would say on a strategic level, though, is when you come to policy and actually when you get in control of these institutions, right? And this is where the last thing I'll just say about it, because I do think someone like Daniel Bessner is correct, which is that unless you really sit down and formulate to some extent what this actually looks like, even like bureaucratically, like what is the U.S., what is a left position? Let's just say that more broadly for X, Y, and Z, right? Then all of the biases that are already in place in Washington will snap into place, and that will favor war, right? And I would say like even Obama, I think actually, other than Libya, which was a huge, obviously, mistake, and also a victory of, these more like, these people who should be totally discredited, like these like, oh yeah, every 5 seconds we should, the world is like just a playground for us to like, relieve our moral anxieties on and generate a bunch of problems, right? So we're not talking about like people like Samantha Power. But, besides Libya, Obama really actually did pull back in a lot of ways from conventional warfare, but then he expanded this massive drone infrastructure, right? And frankly, from a self-interested standpoint, and if we keep the argument to there, I could see just as easily going to people in the middle of the country and being like, look, we're really not going to have, an escalation of any warfare. We're not going to send your kid overseas, but we still might have this giant, unaccountable infrastructure of national security that's killing plenty of people abroad. And that is actually both a huge policy problem and something you're going to need to figure out how to talk to people about in a way that does appeal beyond their self-interest, because, on some level, their self-interest could be in a sick way served by that. Like, okay, I don't have to worry about it and I don't care, and it doesn't implicate my family, supposedly. So that's my final thought on that, at least for me. Go ahead. Sorry.
I view that as more of like when they do that, when Obama does that, I view that as more of like weaselly political doublespeak. And I actually think, like, I get the point you're making that maybe people in the middle of the country could be convinced that for national security reasons, you definitely want to keep the bad guys at bay, and so we have to be there. But that's just a function of like rank propaganda that's being spoon-fed to people. So I actually view that as more of they've moved away from that idea, that principle of non-interventionism. Like, I wouldn't say Obama is a non-interventionist in the same way I wouldn't say Trump is a non-interventionist, even though both of them used at least some rhetoric on the campaign trail, respectively, talking about how, oh, we should end some of these wars. I just view that as like, okay, you're kind of a fraud because I count that as war. If you're doing drone strikes in these countries, it's like, and I use Chomsky's rule on this. Okay, just flip the script and imagine if people were doing that to us, what would we call it? If like China decided, well, we're going to just drone a few KKK enclaves in Texas, we'd be like, the fuck you are, bitch. That's an act of war.
We would be like,
You're not going to bomb in our country. What are you, crazy?
That's okay as long as it's a light touch.
So,
No, exactly. No, on the substance, I agree with you 100%. I do think, it also, I guess the only other thing I would say too is I think it also is thinking of foreign policy too, is like, not in some like dumb pop culture sense. Like obviously you and I are not in the State Department or the Defense Department making policy, but I think to some like we should be absolutely. And I also think like when you and I do cover, even whether we're like advocating on behalf of like, Yemen being the victims of genocide, which the U.S. is actively supporting, or saying like, no, there's a political prisoner in Brazil. We're going to report that story. We're going to try to amplify the voices of our friends overseas or in other countries. That is an act of that solidarity. And I think that is both the better thing to do and in the long term much more advantageous for us than just simply saying like, oh, well, as long as we're not intervening, then, whatever. And I have a different ethos than that, different mindset.
You've done a great job on that, to be fair. I mean, I think you really have, because you're really in tune with what's happening, not just in this country. I've been more U.S. focused, and then every now and then you put a sprinkle of the U.K. in there, and that's just a reflection of the stuff that I'm digesting from mainstream media. But you've done a very good job covering what's happening in Brazil, and you should definitely be commended for that. Let me ask you this question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you care, because I've had this conversation with Glenn Greenwald before and some other people, do you care how they get there? So here's what I mean by that. I'll give you 3 different people. 1, Bernie Sanders. 2, Rand Paul.
Right. 3,
Pat Buchanan. Okay? 3 different people, 3 different reasons for effectively supporting the same position of like, let's get out of Iraq, let's get out of Afghanistan. Okay? Rand Paul comes from a libertarian perspective. Pat Buchanan comes from a paleoconservative perspective. And then, of course, Bernie comes from like a social democratic or democratic socialist, anti-imperialist perspective. Now, ultimately, they end up at the same place on some specific issues. Now, like you said, the devil's in the details. In some ways, I think somebody like Pat Buchanan would support more force than either Rand Paul or Bernie Sanders. But if those people come to you, if you get all 3 of them in a room, and in this hypothetical world, they're all senators, okay? Do you care that like I wouldn't care. I would just say, okay.
Well, if you're talking about, working with people and support, like, I mean, look,
like
Mike Lee is one of the worst members of the U.S. Senate, and he's been indispensable in the thing that Bernie, frankly, is taking the lead on. But I mean, Bernie Sanders, who obviously is the closest to my politics and who I support, and then, Chris Murphy, who's like a good, solid, like, liberal Democrat, and then Mike Lee, who's like a far right Republican. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. Those types of thought experiments really depend. They do have to be specific, because I do think, like, on the other hand, I think it's different, in terms of like, oh, I'll partner with some other like Twitter personality to like retweet each other. I think then it's like you need to think about that a little bit. And then if it's a presidential campaign, to me though, I can't look at it that way, because then I'm also going to have to be looking at trade, the environment. Like
no, not presidential campaign.
Oh, I mean, dude, as far as working in Congress and supporting legislation, it's already self-evident that at least on really key things like Yemen, or as a matter of fact, I mean, the Iran sanctions package, Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul were the only people to vote to protect the Iran deal, which is, I think, the most important thing that has happened. I mean, that's a huge accomplishment of Obama. Yeah. So, that 100% on that level, if I was in the Senate, I would be partnering with all sorts of people I don't like on Iran, Yemen, and anything else I could do to stop that type of stuff.
I totally agree with you, but we actually live in a time and place where that's controversial. Like, a lot of people would just say no.
Well, that's wacky. If you can't understand, I understand, you get into more subtle debates about, who do you want to partner with, or who do you want to, whatever, I get some of those arguments, and they're worth teasing out. But if you don't understand how Congress works, I mean, that is that's remedial stuff as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I would say that, again, as long as and this is what I said back. I was at this Politicon debate, and I was on stage. I think the topic was like, how are we going to get along? And it was like me and a couple odious actors, including Charlie Kirk, was on the same stage. And I basically said, like, we'll get along when we get along. Like, we'll work together when we work together.
Yep.
Like, you're not going to get me to budge on what my values are and what my policy beliefs are and what my principles are. But if there happen to be a couple areas where your policy ideas cross with my policy ideas, then we'll work on those things. But on everything else, I'm coming after you and I'm going to beat you, you know?
Definitely.
And like he, for example, came to the position of like, he probably just despises Muslims. And out of that came this hatred of Saudi Arabia. And so when I said like, hey, we shouldn't arm Saudi Arabia, he was like, yeah. Now, in his mind, it's probably because he just doesn't like Muslims. Obviously, my take on that is a hell of a lot more thoughtful. But either way, if fundamentally we're coming to the same position, then on that position, okay, fine, we can work together.
Well, I think but that's a good. So when we get into media, like that's a good example of like, look, if we all want to sign a letter together that says something about arms sales to Saudi Arabia, let's all put our name on it. And sign a petition or hold signs up or whatever. That's awesome. I think when, if it's like, hey, why don't you and Charlie do a show together, and 50% of it is Charlie saying like weird, bigoted shit about Muslims, and then 50% of it is you talking about like the geopolitics in the Middle East, I'm going to say, yeah, we're going to have to do something much different than that or not do it at all. So I think it's really subtle. But I think the only other thing I'd say about it, I think there's another problem with the extent to which everything has become so mediaized, because it's like, the fact even that people, one way or another, either people who are just like, no, like Bernie can't work with Mike Lee, which is just insane. Or on the other hand, people who are like, oh, me like retweeting some alt-right account about Syria is the same as Bernie working with Mike Lee. It's like both of those positions are pretty fucking dumb. You know what I mean? Like both of those things are not analogous. And I think, especially when it comes to Congress, like you need to be reminded of how that shit actually works and the very specific role of it. And if anybody would criticize Bernie for working with Mike Lee, that's demented.
Yeah, I agree with that. All of that.
The last thing, we only have a couple minutes left, but talk about the economic justice pledge. What's going on, Kyle? And how come I never get called in on these conspiracies? What the fuck?
Well, so I wasn't even called in on this one. I was a little bit of an afterthought, but basically, Cenk Uygur of TYT came up with this idea to do what's called the Progressive Economic Pledge. And the idea was this doesn't encapsulate like all of our issues, because obviously, the lefty platform is quite long, and so a lot of things are left off this. All the things that are like not core economic issues are left off this. So that obviously means there's nothing necessarily addressing foreign policy. There's nothing addressing criminal justice reform and legalizing marijuana and things of that nature. But it's basically like 5 very, very simple, very, very basic, very bare minimum things that we're asking all of the presidential candidates to sign. And actually not just all the presidential candidates, they just want everybody to sign it. So they want, it's kind of like, the idea is kind of like the Grover Norquist 1990s tax pledge. And
right.
For people who are unaware of that, let me just fill them in real quick. The idea was, I think the pledge basically said something along the lines of, if you're a Republican and you're running for elected office, you have to promise to not raise any taxes. Like, it's kind of like a first do no harm idea for the far right. It's like, just don't raise any taxes. And so what happened was Grover Norquist was very successful in getting like a lot of Republicans to sign on to this, because it was viewed as like the key litmus for like meeting the bare minimum requirement for being acceptable to conservative voters. That we're doing that with the left. So the idea is the first plank is higher wages, which is $15 minimum wage, right to collective bargaining. Then we have Medicare for all as the second plank. Then we have Green New Deal, defined as a 10-year plan to get off of fossil fuels and create millions of green infrastructure jobs. And then we have college for all and ending the corruption in our government. So 5 super simple, super basic things: higher wages, Medicare for all, Green New Deal, college for all, end the corruption. And like, we hope every Democratic candidate's going to sign it. People who've already signed it, by the way, Ro Khanna has already signed it. Bernie Sanders has already signed it. AOC has already signed it. And then I'm not sure the total number, but it's definitely in the thousands so far, because this thing was launched. I did a segment on it. Cenk did a big speech about it in Iowa. And we're talking about it now, which is good. We're just trying to get the word out as much as possible so that everybody signs it. You should call your Congress people and try to get them to sign it. You should get in touch with different presidential candidates and try to get them to sign it. And again, the idea is just bare minimum. Hey, can you reach this absolute bare minimum requirement to be considered like serious on the left?
Yeah, I really like, I mean, you know, some other time I have some of the concerns about the Constitutional Convention, but what I really like about it is, you know, and I don't know, people have been noticing I've been getting a little bit more critical of Warren in some ways, and that's maybe another conversation, but like, keep it simple. I just like that idea of like, get them really clearly defined bullet points on a bunch of major issues, and then just yes or no. Like, there isn't that much room for nuance on Medicare for all or collective bargaining or raising wages. In fact, there's no room for nuance.
That's right.
Like,
yep.
There's none.
Yep.
So just do it or don't. And that's fucking awesome that you're giving them that do it or don't pressure.
It's not me, it's Cenk. But yeah, I'm more than happy to help him, because I think that this is a great idea, and I hope that we get everybody on the record, because that's all we could ever ask for is clarity.
Absolutely. No, it's perfect. And it also gives us, that basis upon which to, you know, I think on that level get super specific, like not in the terms of like, you know, most people aren't going to read vastly complicated bills, but things actually should be, you know, like a graph, right? Like, I support a plan to cover with high quality, full, robust healthcare every single person in this country, period. Are you an up on that or a down on that? That's
it's
it.
It's not even like we're saying like, hey, it's Medicare for all and it's only this version of Medicare for all. There's a variety of different kinds of single payer healthcare systems. There's, you know, the French style system and the Canadian style system and the UK style system. Sometimes it's public funding of public institutions. Sometimes it's public funding of private institutions. But the only thing that's the connecting tissue is that it's a single payer.
Precisely.
You know, so
yep.
So as long as you agree to one of those, well then okay, you can sign the pledge. And it's again, bare minimum type stuff here. So I hope, you know, they all get on board, and I hope everybody gets involved. Sign it yourself if you're listening now and you're interested in this, because it really helps. The more people that we get to sign that pledge, the more power the left has. And I know that they were in Iowa and they were talking to some of the presidential candidates. Cenk was there with hundreds of people. A lot of the presidential candidates who showed up had like no supporters. And then there's Cenk with hundreds of supporters. And so what's happening is we're making them bend the knee to left-wing goals. And that's exactly what we're supposed to do and what's supposed to be a democracy.
Absolutely. Kyle Kulinski, tell all the people all the ways they can find. I mean, I'm sure most know, but just in case you don't, tell them how.
Sure. You could find me at Secular Talk on YouTube, and it's at Kyle Kulinski on Twitter.
And if you're watching this on Kyle's channel, at _Michael Brooks on Twitter and Michael Brooks Show on YouTube. Thanks a million, man. Let's do this again soon.
All right. Thanks, Ben. Nice talking to you.
All right. Take care. You've just watched a Michael Brooks Show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.